Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participant lines are in a listen-only mode. After today's presentation, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, and at that time, you may do so by pressing star 1 on your phone's keypad. Today's conference call is being recorded. If you have any objections to this, please disconnect at this time. And now I will turn the call over to your host for today, Mr. Andrew Haight. Sir, you may begin.
Great. Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to any of our West Coast or California or Alaska or Hawaii attendees. My name is Andy Haight. I'm an economist here at the U.S. Census Bureau at our headquarters office in Maryland. And today we're going to be talking about the 2017 economic census. This is the first in a 20-part webinar series. Those webinars are going to be done in 2 basic formats. One set, 10 of the webinars, will be structured around the geographies, individual states. The second set of webinars, the other 10, will be structured according to NAICS sectors, the North American Industry Classification Code sectors, or groups of sectors. So as you can see on the slide that you should be seeing on your screen, today we're going to be talking about the local area data that we have released for the states of Arizona, California, Colorado, Hawaii, and Nevada. Future webinars will cover all of the other states, and we will be releasing that data on a flow basis. That's why we're doing this on a flow. Tomorrow's webinar will be focusing on the first of our sector-level programs, and specifically we're talking about the utilities data. So to get us started, I want to provide a little bit of context about the Census Bureau. You'd have to be living under a rock to not know that we are getting ready to conduct the largest peacetime mobilization that we do here in the United States. This week or next week, every household in America will be receiving either a postcard or the actual form to respond to the 2020 decennial census. The postcard will invite each of us to go to a website or to call a phone number to actually complete our decennial census filings. Some of us will be receiving the actual form itself. And we'll be able to go on and fill that form out either on paper, or we could also go to the form, to the web URL, or to the phone number. A very small percentage of Americans will not receive either of those two and will in fact be enumerated by hand. These would include what we call group quarters. Group quarters are college dormitories or prisons or military barracks or similar places where we can send an enumerator and actually collect the information about all the people that live in that building all at one time. But while that is the largest of the Census Bureau's program, it is certainly not the only thing we do. I've been doing a lot of presentations over my 30-plus years at Census, and one of the most common questions I get is, I know what you do once every 10 years. What do you do with the other 9? If I had $1 for every time someone asked me that question, I'd be retired by now. We conduct more than 130 different monthly, quarterly, and annual censuses and surveys every single year. They include, of course, the decennial census, but they also include a really fantastic program called the American Community Survey, or the ACS. The ACS is essentially the replacement for the old decennial census long form. Up through 2000, we used to mail out 2 forms for the decennial census. Most people got the short form. A few lucky individuals got the long form. The ACS replaces that long form, but it now provides that data every single year, that really detailed demographic, socioeconomic, and housing data every single year as part of the American Community Survey. But in addition to those demographic surveys, we also conduct a number of business programs. And this is the side of the Census Bureau that I care the most about because it's the side that I actually work in. Every 5 years, we do a complete census of governments, and every 5 years, we do an economic census. So let's talk a little bit about those 58 different programs. I like using this pyramid analogy because it does give you some information about both the contents and the hierarchy of each of our economic programs. At the very top of the pyramid are our monthly and quarterly surveys. Every single month, we conduct 17 of the 22 leading economic indicator surveys that you hear about on the evening news. They include programs like our monthly retail trade survey that would include data on how many cars were sold in the United States last month. They include our trade data that publishes detailed monthly information on imports and exports. These are really timely surveys, but they're fairly highly aggregated when it comes to the level of geography. Most of these monthly and quarterly surveys are only shown at the national level, so they are very good in terms of a timely snapshot of the U.S. economy, but they don't give you that rich detail that our other programs do provide. Below the monthly and quarterly surveys, we have our annual programs. These annual surveys are more detailed than what are available in the monthly and quarterly surveys. They include information not only at the national level, but they even include data down to the state, metropolitan area, and even county level. And one of these annual surveys, County Business Patterns, actually provides data all the way down to zip code. These are business information for detailed industries down to the zip code level. But at the very bottom of this pyramid is the program that we're going to talk about today, and that is the economic census. Every 5 years, we do a complete census of every employer business in the United States. There's about 8 million employer businesses. The economic census covers almost all of them. So let's talk a little bit more detail about the economic census. This is our most comprehensive and our most detailed program that we conduct at the Census Bureau on the economic side. It covers nearly every 2 through 6-digit code covered by the Census Bureau. These are the North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS codes. There are some exceptions or some exclusions. The big one that you can see here on the slide is agriculture. We don't publish data for agriculture because the U.S. Department of Agriculture does. They started doing that survey in 1997. We did it prior to 1997. I've also included a link here to a list of other exclusions. So, for example, we don't cover colleges and universities because the National Center for Education Statistics does. One point I did want to make to you all is these presentation materials, the PowerPoint file itself, as well as the recording and a transcript will be provided to you all after we actually complete the webinar. So you don't have to frantically be writing down that URL there. The economic census is one of the most detailed programs also because it provides the most detailed geographic information that we have available on the econ side. The economic census covers data at the national, state, metropolitan area, and even county levels. This slide is actually incorrect because it says place. We are publishing place-level data for some sectors, but there has been some adjustments to the level of data, and you'll learn more about that later. In addition to the basic dimensions of industry and geography, the economic census also publishes other dimensions of data. Data are broken out by business size. A very common question I get is, Andy, how many small businesses are there in the United States? And I will always ask the person, well, what do you mean by small? Do you mean an individual store that has less than 5 employees? Or do you mean a corporation that has less than $100 million worth of sales? In the economic census, we publish data both by employment size and by revenue size, and we publish the data by the individual business, what we call establishments, and by company size. So there's 4 dimensions that are available. So whatever your definition is of a small business, we have data that helps to support that. We also publish data in the economic census on franchise status, looking at how many restaurants there are in the United States and then separating them out, broken out by whether they're franchise or non-franchise. And for all the franchise businesses, how many of them are franchisee versus franchisor owned can be very useful to someone who's interested in opening a restaurant. They may be interested in saying, am I going to save money in terms of paying my employees if I'm a franchise? What is the average payroll per employment of franchise restaurants as opposed to non-franchise restaurants? That type of data is available in the economic census. It's also our most detailed program because it provides the most detailed data variables. There's over 200 data variables published in the economic census. They include what we call our core statistics of the number of establishments. An establishment is a business at a single physical location, employment, payroll, and some measure of output, whether that output is measured by sales or shipments or receipts or revenue or even work done. We publish detailed information on that. In fact, in a few minutes, you'll be hearing a little bit about that revenue data that we have from the economic census. The revenue data are one of those things that make the economic census unique because many of our other programs either don't publish revenue data at all. For example, County Business Patterns just has information on the number of businesses, employment, and payroll, but no data on revenue. Or you have programs like some of our annual programs that do publish revenue but don't break it down below the national level or maybe down to the state level. So the economic census is great because it does have that revenue information down to the individual industries and down by geography. And you'll see that highlighted in a few minutes. One of the other things that we uniquely publish in the economic census is something called product line statistics. Product lines are the detailed products and services provided by businesses. So, for example, if I was interested in opening a convenience store and I wanted to find out what are the types of products and services sold by convenience stores in the U.S., I could look at the product lines data from the economic census, and I could then understand how much of my sales of my convenience store are going to come from tobacco products, are going to come from canned goods, are going to come from gasoline, and the variety of other kinds of products that businesses provide. These product line data are tailored to the individual industry. So the questions that we ask a doctor's office, what are their products and services, are very different than the questions we ask a grocery store or other types of business. For the 2017 economic census, we're going to be changing how we publish our product line data, but you'll learn more about that in a few minutes. The final thing I want to mention about the economic census before we start seeing some information about what's different for 2017 is where we release these data. Historically, we have released the economic census on American Factfinder, which has been our go-to data product since the 1997 economic census. For 2017, we are now releasing the data on our brand new data.census.gov platform. If you all are not already familiar with data.census.gov, I would highly, highly, highly encourage you to go in and start using it because on March 31st, there will not be an American Factfinder anymore. You will have to access the data from data.census.gov. However, we do have the data from the economic census in other platforms as well, including a data tool that's near and dear to my heart, Census Business Builder, and we also have it elsewhere. So let's talk a little bit about the flow of data from the economic census. The economic census data are released on a flow basis, which means that we started releasing data in September of last year, and we will release the last data products, as you can see on this screen, in around September of 2021. And you may be saying, wow, that's a long period of time to release all the data. Why does it take you guys so long to release it all? It's because of that detailed, rich data that are available. It takes our analysts a while to get that data right, to make sure that we've analyzed it thoroughly, because those other annual, monthly, and quarterly surveys are baselined or benchmarked back to the economic census. If we don't get a good economic census every 5 years, then those other surveys that are then baselined and benchmarked back to it could then be impacted. So as you can see from this high-level release schedule, we started releasing the data in what we call the first look in September of last year. The first look report provided national-level estimates at the 2 through 6-digit NAICS, so it did give you the full industry breakout, but again, just national-level data. In January, we started releasing the local area data. And this is the reason why we're doing the webinar today, to talk about the flow of data that's coming out from these geographic area statistics and to kind of talk about the information that has been released as part of them. That flow, as you can see on the slide, will continue through November of this year, but I have it on good authority that it's likely we will be completing the geographic area series before then. In a few moments, I'll show you a release schedule where you can go in and see exactly what has been released. I would highly encourage you all to check out that release schedule periodically to see if the data that you care about has already been released or not. After we complete the geographic area statistics, we will then start moving on to the product statistics, the establishment of firm size reports, and we'll finally close out with what we call the miscellaneous subjects reports. So let's now talk about those geographic area statistics. This slide provides a little bit of information about this release flow and some resources that you can turn to learn about what's been released. When you go to the URL that I've provided here on this slide, you get 3 pieces of information. At the very top, you get a link to an Excel file that tells you in a tabular format what has been released. Just below there, you have a upcoming releases link that tells you what are the data products that are going to be released in the next 30 days. Okay? In between those two, we have this really nice little infograph. And I have a screenshot of it over here on the right-hand side of the slide. For those of you who might have gone onto this website, you may notice that my screenshot here is a little bit out of date. This thing is getting updated every single week, and even in the 2 weeks that has gone by from when I updated it last, we've already released much more data. Now, you'll notice that we have started releasing data on the West Coast and on the East Coast first. And you may be wondering, why is it that Census flows out the data in that way? Why do they release the data for those West Coast states first, and why do they do the East Coast states later, and how does that work? And essentially, the reason why we flow the data out that way is because of crossover metropolitan areas. Okay, now I'm going to clarify what I mean by that. When you think about our ability to release data for a metropolitan area, we release the data for the metro area as a whole, but we also then release the data for the county components that comprise that metropolitan area. So when you have a case like the Honolulu Metropolitan Statistical Area that contains data for Honolulu County, the ability to publish data for that metropolitan area where all the counties that make up that metro are in that same state is relatively easy. So we start first with the states that are quote-unquote easy, that either have only metropolitan areas that are fully enclosed within their state, that metropolitan area does not cross state boundaries, or where the crossover metropolitan area only crosses into one other state. So, for example, California was one of our first states that we started releasing. There is only one metropolitan area in the state of California that crosses into a neighboring state, and it's only the one metro that does that only crosses into one county in Nevada. So it's relatively easy, if you will, for us to review the data for the state of California, for that metro area, and for all of its county components, because they are all included within that state, or in this case, one other state. As you move toward the center of the nation, metropolitan areas get infinitely more complicated. When you think about a state like Illinois, Illinois has metropolitan areas that straddle every single state that surround that state. So for the ability for us to publish data for Illinois, we have to then essentially lock down the data for all of the neighboring states at that same time in what we call disclosure groups that allow us to actually tabulate and analyze and make sure that the data are correct before we release it. As you can see at the very bottom of the slide, Colorado was actually our first state that we released. The data started coming out on January 9th. Arizona, California, Hawaii, and Nevada started the week after that on January 16th. And these are some of our first states that we started releasing. Now let's talk a little bit about changes that you're going to see in the 2017 economic census. When we think about changes from the economic census, they can be grouped into 3 or 4 broad categories. The first are geographic area changes. For data users who are using our data and are making comparisons between the 2017 economic census and the prior economic censuses, it is very, very, very important to make sure that the geography that you are comparing is in fact comparable. And I would argue that this concern about comparability of geography is not only important for users who are using Census Bureau business data, but I would argue that the same kind of thing ought to be considered when you're using any business data. I've talked to dozens of, maybe even hundreds of data users over my career who are about ready to make a comparison between the boundaries of, we're about ready to make a comparison of their particular city over time, but their city had some type of boundary change, and some large percentage of the change that they were about ready to highlight was actually more of a figment of the boundary change than actually of real economic growth. The town that I live in annexed a piece of the neighboring land, and when our town people were about ready to do a press release about the economy of my town, they were about ready to tout how great the economy is and how much it's growing because look how much has happened in the last 5 or 10 years. And I'm like, whoa, guys, time out. The boundaries of our town changed. Some amount of that geographic of that growth is actually not real. Those businesses have been there all along. So it's very important to understand those geographic changes, and you'll be learning a little bit more about those changes in just a moment. In addition, the classification system that we use for those industries also changes, and we'll talk about those changes in just a minute too. We have those product data that I mentioned before for the 2017 economic census. We're now publishing them on the NAPS basis. We'll learn a little bit about that. And finally, we have some other changes. So let's talk about geography first. And the next couple of slides are going to give us information about the geographic changes for the 5 states that we're talking about today. So for the state of Arizona, there were no metropolitan area changes. So that means that if I was comparing data for the Phoenix metro area between 2017 and 2012, I could know that that metro area is exactly the same in 17 as it was in 2012. However, 105 of the economic places in Arizona had some type of change. 56 of them had area gain. 46 of them had area loss, meaning they lost area to a neighboring area. There was one place that actually had a name change. So if you are looking for the data for Buckeye in 2017 and trying to find that same data in 2012, you will not find it because it wasn't called Buckeye in 2012. There's 2 brand new places that we are recognizing for the first time. Usually this happens because of demographic growth. So when the population of a city or a small town grows above 2,500, we can then actually publish it as part of the economic census. It's valid for inclusion. So, for example, here in Arizona, Morenci CDP and Desert Hills CDP are 2 brand new places that for the first time ever qualified to be included in the economic census. Likewise, when you see population decline, we then sometimes have to drop a place where it no longer qualifies. So as you can see, there's one in Arizona, Black Canyon City, CDP, its population has now declined enough where it now doesn't qualify separately. To learn more about the details of these 56 places that had area gain and area loss, in the upper right-hand corner, I have a link to our geographies page on the Economic Census website where you can go in and actually learn more about what are those 56 places that had area gain. And finally, at the bottom of the page, I have a link to our TigerWeb Econ tool, which is a map-based interface that allows you to go in and actually see those geographies that changed so you can make the decision, is that area gain something I ought to be concerned about or not? Perhaps, so I'll give you an example. For the town that I live in, the annexation that occurred added 37 businesses, but not a single house. There's no people that live in the piece of land that my town annexed when the boundary changed. So from a demographic standpoint, yes, there was a boundary change, but it doesn't affect anything. There's no people living there, so it never had a problem. But for a business perspective, those businesses that have been there all along that now are included in the boundaries of the town, now you would want to be aware of that. So seeing those boundary changes, you can actually see that in TigerWeb. This is the slide for California. Again, like Arizona, there were no metropolitan area changes, but 445 of the places had some type of change. 235 places gained area, 138 lost area. One place had a name change. UC Davis actually now has its own CDP, and its name has been changed. There were 20 brand new places and 6 places that dropped. Over on the right-hand side, again, you can see a little screenshot of this website where you can see what are those 20 brand new places that we added. In Colorado, again, no metropolitan area changes, and a similar sort of thing, 170 places that had some type of change, area gain, area loss. There were no places whose name changed. There were 7 brand new places and 1 that dropped. So again, when we're using the data and we're trying to understand how comparable it is over time, these resources are really important. Hawaii, again, no metropolitan area changes. We had area gain and loss, no name changes, 6 brand new places, and one drop place. I am intrigued by the name of a town called Volcano CDP. I feel like I have to go and visit that and see who lives in Volcano CDP. The state of Nevada, again, had no metropolitan area changes and had a relatively small number of economic place changes, some with area gain, some with area loss, no places with a name change, no new places, and only 1 dropped place. So this is sort of an interesting one. The city of Mesquite straddles 2 counties, and apparently the part of Mesquite City that was in Lincoln County is now no longer part of the city of Mesquite. So that boundary change now, the part that was in Lincoln County is now no longer part of the city of Mesquite. So it's now sort of considered a dropped place. So that's our geography changes for the 2017 economic census. Again, I really encourage folks to go in there and check out what those changes are, because when you're making those comparisons over time, you have to make sure the data that you're comparing is in fact comparable. So let's now change gears and talk a little bit about the industry changes that you're going to see when looking at the data for these 5 states in the 2017 economic census. NAICS, the North American Industry Classification System, is a system that we use to classify every single business in the United States. And I want to make a couple of quick questions that people often ask me. First, we assign the NAICS code to the business based upon their primary activity. So we don't let the business per se assign their own industry code. We assign it for them, and we do sometimes correct the industry code based upon what they tell us. So if you have a business that both sells gasoline and runs a convenience store, and they happen to have a really good gas year and not such a great convenience store year, they might actually change industry classification codes. An even better example is a restaurant that has a bar in that same restaurant. I have a friend of mine who owns a bar and grill in town. Last year, he did really, really well in his bar. The restaurant didn't do so great. His head chef left, so people weren't buying food, but boy, were they drinking. His business is now classified as a bar, not as a restaurant, because the majority of his sales are now in the bar, not in the food. So we do assign the codes. We assign a single NAICS code, a single 6-digit NAICS code to every individual establishment. That's really important too, because when you think about very diversified companies, how would you classify an entire corporation to a single industry as opposed to the individual locations of that corporation? We assign the NAICS codes based upon the individual establishments. Now, for the 2017 economic census, there have been a number of changes to the NAICS system, and these next few slides highlight those changes. I want to point out a couple of things. The green highlighted ones are combinations, cases where we used to publish data broken out into a certain breakout, but we've now consolidated those codes into one particular code. The biggest reason why this happens is because of industry decline or because of industry consolidation. So let me give you a specific example. In the right-hand side, you can see an area for household cooking appliance, household refrigerator and home freezer manufacturers, household laundry equipment, and other major household appliance manufacturers. Those four industries have now been consolidated into a single NAICS code for the 2017 economic census, primarily because the number of companies in the United States that make these four types of appliances has declined to such an extent that there are now not enough businesses in each of those industries to allow us to publish the detailed information. Remember that the Census Bureau is committed to the privacy of the businesses who respond to our surveys. So if you have a relatively small number of businesses making a particular product or selling a particular product in an area, we couldn't publish the data because doing so would disclose their identity. So this is a case where we've actually consolidated codes. The peach kind of highlighted ones are codes where there's been some kind of partial shifts. So if you notice, we've changed the way crude petroleum and natural gas extraction is classified. If you are just extracting crude petroleum, you're now in one code. The natural gas extraction has now been merged in with natural gas liquid extraction. So we have those kind of things. The blue highlighted ones are cases where it's simply a recode, meaning the content of that industry has not changed at all, but the code that we classify it under has. So when you're now looking for data, for example, for general merchandise stores or all other general merchandise stores, that NAICS code is now a different NAICS code. Again, this is important when you're using these data because you want to make sure that you're pulling the data that's the correct industry. Here's a few other changes that have occurred. Again, a number of one-to-one reclassifications in the real estate and rental and leasing sector. For professional, scientific, and technical services, this is the only sector that has had a truly brand new, never published before kind of a code, and that is for research and development in nanotechnology. We're going to be publishing data for the very first time for that industry, and you will actually see that in the data that we publish. Let's talk a little bit about NAPS. The NAPS codes are these product codes that we publish as part of the economic census. In 2012, we used to publish the product data in three basic ways. For manufacturing mining, they showed the data one way. For the construction sectors, they showed it a different way. And for all of the other economic census sectors, they showed it a third way. Under this new classification system, NAPS, all of these products are now going to be published consistently across their different sectors. So what that will allow users to do is hopefully allow them to more easily combine product data across industries. So for example, let's say you were interested in shoes and you wanted to get information on shoe manufacturers, on shoe wholesalers, on shoe stores, and on shoe repair. Those would be four completely different industries, and they would have historically had four very different ways of publishing the product data for those four different industries. Under NAPS, that shoe data will be more consistently displayed. A few other changes I want to quickly highlight to make you aware of this is the establishment and firm size reports, those great data products that have the information broken out by the size of the business, are also being consolidated. That's going to make it much, much easier for people to be able to combine and compare data on small business across sectors. So very often I'll get users that'll say, Andy, I want to find information about small retailers and small wholesale businesses in my county. How can I do that? In the past, I would have made them go to two different size tables, one for retail and one for wholesale, and they would have had to pull that data and combine it. Now it'll be together into one big consolidated table. We also are making some changes to the miscellaneous subjects reports. There's a couple of tables that are being dropped and a few being added. The big change here is that we're not publishing any more zip code level data. So for some of you who are accustomed to seeing zip code statistics published in the economic census, specifically in our geographic area reports, we're not going to be publishing that zip code level data. And you may be saying, oh, that's such a bummer. That zip code data was so detailed. It really isn't a bummer at all. because we still do publish zip code level data in something called ZBP, which is Zip Code Business Patterns. In fact, in my 30-plus years at Census, I don't know that I have ever referred a data user to the every 5 years economic census zip code data because we have annual data from Zip Code Business Patterns. So when we decided to get rid of the zip code data from the Econ Census, I said our users aren't going to mind because they've been using ZBP, at least based upon my recommendations, for years. We are dropping the place-level data for manufacturing. That means we will not be publishing data by city and town for the manufacturing sector. Again, some of this is because of our privacy rules. And, of course, we're now publishing data on the new data.census.gov platform. So let's now kind of close out the webinar today by talking a little bit about where you can go to access these data and give you some highlights of data from these 5 states. So, of course, the new data.census.gov platform at the bottom is where you're going to want to go to primarily access data from the economic census. But we also have economic census data released in QuickFacts, which is a tool that's available right on the main Census Bureau's homepage and on our Census Business Builder data tool. When we are releasing these data, we are also releasing some fun facts that we are putting out in social media and in other platforms. These are the fun fact files that we have released for the 5 states that we've been talking about. So in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the fun fact for the state of Arizona, California, Colorado, Hawaii, and Nevada. These fun facts are intended to highlight a particular sector in that state. Usually it's the top sector in the state. Sometimes it may be just another important sector in the state. But it gives you kind of a fun fact for that particular area. I personally really love the use of the 50-state quarters on these, and we've been getting some really nice feedback on them. I have provided here on the bottom the link to where you can go to get each of these fun facts, the visualizations page, and where we've also released an American Count story about America's changing economy, and the link to that is in the top right-hand corner. So let's provide a little bit of facts for some of these states. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the key data variables that we publish in the economic census is revenue. Sales, shipments, receipts, revenue, or business done. So these 2 charts here just give you a taste for the types of data that we have available for the state of Arizona. As you can see, the wholesale trade sector of the sectors that we have released so far has had the highest sales of any sector in the state of Arizona. You will notice a note at the bottom of the page that we don't publish revenue data at the state level for a few sectors like utilities, information, and the financial insurance sectors. And we haven't released all of the data for every single state anyway. So mining, construction, manufacturing, and the management of companies and enterprises sectors, those bars you can see are missing. We haven't yet released those data. Looking at how that, how that revenue data has changed over time, you can see that while the wholesale trade sector has the largest revenue, largest sales, the retail trade sector actually saw a much higher increase in the sales from 2012 to 2017 in the state of Arizona. Looking at California, once again, we see wholesale trade really dominating, but in this case, the wholesale trade sector also saw the largest increase in the sales. This percentage increase for the state of California was one of the highest so far that we've seen in the nation, shows the strength of the wholesale trade sector in the state of California. The state of Colorado, once again, we see that wholesale trade dominates, but again, just like Arizona, the retail sector has actually grown slightly more in terms of its sales from 2012 to 2017 as compared to the wholesale sector. For the state of Hawaii, Hawaii is sort of interesting because the retail trade sector is actually one of the highest sales. It's probably a function as much of tourism as it is for other things. You also notice that the accommodation and food services sector is really high. And again, we see this big increase in wholesale trade going from 2012 to 2017. And finally, for the state of Nevada, The retail trade sector is the highest sector, just like in Hawaii, and it also has seen the largest increase. Although you can definitely see accommodation and food services in Nevada has increased a lot too. Now, these last couple of slides have been looking at data just at the state level and just at these individual two-digit NAICS sectors. I would really encourage you all to go in and check out the data by county and by metropolitan areas to be able to see, for example, in this big increase in the sales in the accommodation and food services sector, how much of that sales in Nevada has increased in Clark County versus in the rest of the state? Is Clark County really dominating that particular state in terms of accommodation and food services? If you didn't know, Clark County is actually where the city of Las Vegas is physically located, or are we seeing a similar increase in the accommodation and food services sector in other communities as well? And then even within the accommodation and food services sector, is that all hotels that are growing, or is it also the restaurants that are growing that fast as well? So to summarize, the economic census really provides an amazing wealth of business data. I would encourage you all to go in and check out our economic census website to learn more about the wealth of data that's available from the economic census. The data that we release are released on this flow basis, and knowing what is available to you is something that you ought to be checking out. We've been really encouraging people to go to that releases data visualization first before going into data.census.gov, because there's no sense hunting for data that hasn't yet been released. That release visualization can actually save you some time. When you're looking at data over time, you want to make sure that the thing you're comparing is comparable, and because geographies constantly change, we've provided information available to you to help you understand those geographic changes. And again, I provide the link here to that geographies page. Again, the economic census publishes data on the NAICS basis, and the NAICS codes have changed for 2017. And again, we are now releasing that information, that we have this information where you can learn more about that. And finally, the last thing I want to mention is, again, data from the economic census are now being released on the new data.census.gov platform. American Fact Finder is being retired on March 31st, and so I would highly encourage you all to get out there and start using data.census.gov, familiarizing yourself with where information is available, and most importantly, providing feedback. Data.census.gov in many ways is the way American Fact Finder was in 1997 when it was first launched. It has a lot of really great features. It also has some challenges, and they are very much looking forward to people's feedback on what they like about it and what they don't. So I would really encourage you all to check that out. So with that, operator, let's go ahead and see if there's any questions.
Certainly. At this time, if you'd like to ask a question, please press star then 1 on your phone's keypad. Please unmute your phone and record your name at the prompt. If at any time your question has been answered, you can remove your request by pressing star 2. Once again, that is star 1 for questions over the phone at this time. And one moment for our first question, please. Your line is open.
Great, thank you. Yes, I'm wondering when the business owner demographic information from 2017 is released.
Right. So the program that you're referring to has historically been called the Survey of Business Owners, SBO. We also released a program in a couple of years ago called the Annual Survey of Entrepreneurs. SBO and ASE provided information on the race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status of the business owner. And as you probably already know, it sounds like you know, both of those two surveys are being replaced with a brand new program called the Annual Business Survey, or ABS. That survey right now is scheduled for release this spring. Right now, the best that I can tell you is April. Hope springs eternal. A colleague of mine in the room is actually shaking her head. It might be a little later than that, but I would encourage you to check back on that ABS website to find out when it's going to be going live. The ABS will completely replace SBO and ASC. And right now, they're still sort of working out the detailed data that they're going to be able to publish in there. So that's the best I can tell you. Sorry.
Okay.
Did you have any other questions?
Just will that include place-based, place-level information? Because we try to track how the demographics are changing for business ownership.
So the survey of business owners had data at the national, state, county, and a little bit of data at the place level. The annual survey of entrepreneurs that we added after SBO, that was an annual program, only showed data at the state level. So my guess is going to be that they're only going to be showing data at the state and county level. If they do go down to place, it probably will not be as detailed as it used to be. There was never very much in there in the first place, because when you start to get down to individual cities and towns, you often start running into suppressions of data because there's so few, let's say, Hispanic-owned or women-owned or veteran-owned businesses in a particular small town that publishing the data would make that a disclosure.
But for a large city.
Right. For the larger cities, you should be able to get data. But again, I would check out the ABS website to learn some more about the level of geography that they're going to be publishing.
Thank you. Our next question, your line is open.
Thank you. I'm wondering when I'll be able to find the equivalent of the Fact Finder state maps for NAICS 332721 at the census.data.gov. There's just some preliminary overview numbers, and while those are helpful, I really wanted to know when I'd be able to look at a state-level view.
Right. So the data for the manufacturing sector is scheduled for release at the end of our flow. So remember when I was mentioning how we released the data in the geographic area series on a flow basis. We started releasing in Colorado for a number of sectors in January. Manufacturing, mining, construction, and management of companies and enterprises. Those four sectors are all scheduled to be released at the end of the flow, which right now the best I can tell you is start checking back around August 1st. We may have some data released by then, or certainly check that release page. When those data do go live, you will be able to access them in data.census.gov, and that tool does include a mapping feature where you could go in and actually look at that economic census data for manufacturing for that specific NAICS code in a map-based display. I will also tell you that by the time that happens, we will also have that data available in Census Business Builder, which is very much a map-based interface. So if you want to be able to view that business data on manufacturing by geography in a map-based display, I would encourage you to check it out in Census Business Builder. Again, you're going to need to check back probably around the beginning of August. Now, one thing I just want to make sure that you know is we do have data on manufacturing at the county level in county business patterns and in our non-employer statistics program. It's just not going to include some of the data variables like value of shipments that you may be accustomed to looking at from the economic census.
Right. That's what I need to get a denominator of sales per employee and comparative advantage state by state.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's a really common use. It's probably one of the biggest reasons why we do the economic census is because of that shipments and that revenue data that is so unique to the economic census. Yeah, unfortunately, you got to wait a little longer. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
The next question, your line is open.
Hi, thanks for doing the webinar. I had a quick question. If someone is interested in a particular type of business within a broader category, is this the best way to get that economic data? So, for example, if someone's interested in seafood restaurants as opposed to restaurants overall, how could someone get data related just to seafood restaurants?
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. So when you look at the NAICS classification system, there is not a specific 6-digit NAICS code for seafood restaurants. There's a code for full-service restaurants. There's a code for limited-service restaurants. But that menu type of seafood does not have its own NAICS code. But there are data products that actually provide that additional level of detail, and one of them actually is the economic census. In one of our special tables that we publish at the end of the economic census, we have a table on menu type. I believe it's still scheduled to be published for the 2017 economic census, and that menu type table does then break out the sales of restaurants based upon what is their primary menu type, what is their food specialty. So it would then identify how much of those sales is for seafood restaurants versus hamburger places versus pizza restaurants, et cetera. I will tell you that data are not shown at the full level of geography for some of the same privacy issues that we were talking about earlier, but at least it gives you some insight into how many of those restaurants are available, that are there. What I will tell you is there are other data providers out there that do have data broken out by menu type that are good sources of data as well. The National Restaurant Association does have specific data specifically on food, on the type of menu that they have. Their data are similarly not published down to really detailed, but it is something. But what I always tell people when you're using data from these other data sources, compare it back to the economic census data because of the way we classify businesses, you sometimes see differences. I mentioned earlier that restaurant and bar example. Businesses can flip-flop between being considered a restaurant or considered a bar based upon the primary products, what is their majority sales, whereas that doesn't happen with other data providers. But, yeah, those are a couple of resources.
Thank you. I have one follow-on question. So let's say instead of restaurants, there was a desire to know more about fitness businesses. So as opposed to a gym, you want to know about like a yoga studio. Is there a similar way to kind of dig down into that data? Is there like a supplement that comes at the end that you release, or?
Yeah. So when you think about these sort of different categories of types of businesses, sometimes there is a specific NAICS code for that specific type of business. Other times that the type of business that you care about is published, it just doesn't have its own specific NAICS code. So like you mentioned yoga studios. There is not a specific NAICS code for yoga studios, but yoga studios are published in a broader category of these fitness-type businesses. So just depending upon what level of detail you're interested in, how aggregated you're willing to go, we may have data for you. What I'd suggest maybe is you can see I have my email address and phone number here on the screen. If you'd like, go ahead and send me an email or give me a call when we get off the webinar, and we can walk through some of the industries that you might be interested in.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. The next question, your line is open.
Hi. I was wondering where I could find the data to locate employers in a specific area, region, say if I want to know in the DFW area, and then also maybe Houston, and then if I need to drill down to specifically what does the employment levels look like in Las Colinas and in the downtown Dallas area.
Right. So in the economic census, we will be publishing data for the state of Texas. The data will be available by metro, by county, and even down to individual cities and towns in Texas. Those data in the economic census do cover employer businesses, and as part of that data, you will be able to get information on how many, let's say gas stations or how many manufacturing businesses are there. You can go in and actually look at it by detailed industry, and you can go in and look at their employment, their payroll, and their revenue, their shipments data in an aggregated basis. We do not publish any data that identifies individual businesses by name, but what I often find is users take our data and they look at the totals that we publish for, let's say, a given county. So let's say they're interested in the healthcare sector and they want to know how many doctors' offices are there in a particular county. They will go into our data, they will pull that data on doctors' offices for that county, which will give them the total number of doctors' offices, total employment, total payroll, and total receipts. And then they will turn to another data provider like Dun & Bradstreet or one of the other multiple businesses out there that have individual names and addresses, and then get the information for the names and addresses of those businesses. When they do that, I always remind people to compare the totals from those other providers to the economic census data. They may not always match, and a lot of times that is a function of how we classify the business versus the way a business might have classified themselves in those other providers. But yeah, there's definitely lots of information that you could get for the city of Dallas, for the DFW area, metro area, et cetera. There's a lot of information available.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And once again, if you would like to ask a question, please press star then 1 on your phone's keypad and record your name at the prompt. Our next question is, your line is open.
Hi. Do you have release dates for construction data, either nationwide or specifically for Colorado?
So the construction data, one of the other callers was just asking about manufacturing. Mining, construction, manufacturing, and the management of companies and enterprises, those 4 sectors are all scheduled to be released at the end of our geographic area statistics, which is tentatively right now, I'd say check back at the beginning of August. When the construction data are released, the data for every state, including Colorado and all the counties in Colorado, will be released at that same time. So construction is one of the later sectors that we release. We start off with retail and wholesale and the services sectors, but construction just ends up being one of the later ones.
Gotcha. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Once again, if you do have a question, please press star then 1. Please stand by for any further questions, sir.
Great.
And, sir, it appears we have no further questions at this time.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this webinar. Again, I would encourage you all to check out those resources that we talked about today. And again, the recording will be posted in about 2 or 3 days to our website. So thank you so much for your time and have a great afternoon.